That night, the water didn't just rise. It roared, like it had something to prove. The sky collapsed into darkness. The wind cut through wood and bone, and a group of grown men who had spent their entire lives on that sea, began to believe they would never see land again. These were not strangers to danger. They had wrestled waves before, endured storms that would break lesser men. But this was different. The kind of storm that doesn't just threaten your life, it strips away your control, your confidence, everything you thought you understood about the world. And in the middle of that chaos, while the boat was filling with water, while panic spread from one man to another like fire, there was someone asleep. Not pretending, not unaware, just resting. And what happened next would leave every single man on that boat questioning reality itself, because within moments, the storm that was ready to take their lives would obey a voice. But before we go any further, before we uncover how a storm could be silenced with nothing but words, before we step fully into that night, before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand why that moment mattered, you have to understand who was in that boat. Jesus of Nazareth had already begun to change the rhythm of life across Galilee. People followed him not just because of what he said, but because of what they believed he could do. Stories had started to spread quietly at first, then louder with every passing day. The sick recovering, the broken restored, words that seemed to carry weight far beyond ordinary teaching. And yet, despite everything they had seen, the men closest to him, the disciples, still saw him through the lens of familiarity. Peter, a fisherman, hardened by years on unpredictable waters. James and John, brothers who knew the sea like it was part of their blood. Matthew, who had left behind a life of numbers and structure for something he didn't fully understand. They had chosen to follow Jesus, but like anyone else, they carried doubts they didn't always speak out loud. Because following someone is one thing, trusting them with your life in the middle of chaos is something else entirely. The Sea of Galilee was known for its sudden shifts. What looked calm at sunset could turn deadly before midnight. Cold air rushing down from the surrounding hills would collide with warm air rising from the water, creating violent winds that struck without warning. The disciples knew this. They respected it. They never underestimated it. So when they stepped into that boat with Jesus that evening, there was nothing unusual about it. It was routine. Another crossing. Another journey from one side to the other. The kind of moment that doesn't feel important while you're living it, but later becomes the one you can't stop thinking about. As the boat pushed away from shore, the water was calm. The sky held its peace. There was no sign of what was coming. And maybe that's what made it more unsettling, because danger rarely announces itself before it arrives. At first, it was subtle, a shift in the wind, a slight unease in the movement of the water. The kind of thing only experienced fishermen would notice. Peter would have seen it first. A glance toward the horizon, a quiet tension building in his chest. Then, the wind grew stronger. The surface of the sea began to break. Waves started rising. Not gradually, but aggressively, like something had been unleashed. Within moments, control slipped away. The boat was no longer cutting through the water, it was being thrown by it. The sound of the storm swallowed everything else. Orders shouted between the men, barely carried through the noise. Water crashed over the sides, filling the boat faster than they could throw it out. This wasn't just a storm anymore. This was survival. Every instinct they had took over. Every skill they had learned was put into motion, and still, it wasn't enough. Fear doesn't always show up immediately. Sometimes it builds, layer by layer, until it becomes impossible to ignore. That's what happened in that boat. At first, they fought. They adjusted the sails, tried to stabilize the vessel, worked together the way they always had. But the storm didn't respond the way storms usually did. It didn't ease. It didn't slow. It intensified. And that's when something shifted. The realization that this might be beyond them, that no amount of experience, no level of skill, could guarantee they would make it through. One by one, that thought spread, and suddenly, the strongest men in that boat were no longer thinking about controlling the storm. They were thinking about surviving it, or whether survival was even possible. And then, in the middle of all of it, someone noticed. Jesus was still asleep, not disturbed by the wind, not shaken by the waves, completely at rest while everything else was falling apart. It didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. How could someone remain calm when everyone else was reaching their limit? That image alone must have felt almost unreal. And maybe that's what pushed them over the edge. Because fear has a way of turning into frustration when you feel like you're facing it alone. They didn't approach him calmly. They didn't ask politely. They woke him with urgency, with desperation, with a question that carried more emotion than words could hold. "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" It wasn't just a question. It was an accusation, a cry for help wrapped in fear. What happened next didn't match the intensity of the moment. There was no panic in his response, no rush. Jesus stood up, steady, in a space that refused to stay still. The wind was still howling. The waves were still crashing. Everything around him was out of control. And yet, he didn't react to the storm the way they did. He didn't try to manage it. He didn't fight it. He spoke to it. Peace, be still. Simple words. No force behind them, no visible struggle. And then, silence. Not gradual, not partial, complete. The wind stopped. The waves settled. The sea returned to calm, as if the storm had never existed. One moment, chaos. The next, stillness. The kind of stillness that feels almost louder than the storm itself. But the storm ending wasn't the most powerful part of that moment. It was what followed. The men who had just been fighting for their lives weren't celebrating. They weren't relieved in the way you would expect. They were quiet, watching, processing something they couldn't immediately explain, because they had seen storms before. They had survived danger before, but they had never seen anything like this. And then Jesus spoke again, this time not to the storm, but to them. "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" It wasn't said with anger. It was a question that reached deeper than the surface of what had just happened, because the issue wasn't just the storm. It was what they believed in the middle of it, and that's when the real fear settled in. Not the kind that comes from waves or wind, but the kind that comes from realizing you are in the presence of something you don't fully understand. They looked at each other, not with relief, but with awe. Who is this? That question changed everything, because up until that moment, they had followed Jesus as a teacher, a guide, someone who spoke with authority. But now, they were facing something beyond that. Even the wind and the waves obey him. That wasn't just an observation. It was a realization that redefined everything they thought they knew. Because in their world, the sea wasn't just water. It represented chaos, power, something no human could control. And yet, with a single command, it responded. Not resisted, not delayed, obeyed. That moment didn't just calm a storm. It revealed something about Jesus that words alone could never fully explain. And the question they asked that night is the same question that still lingers today. Who is this? And if the wind and the waves obey him, what does that mean for everything else?